meme I made many years ago, many years ago, and it's just showing these eight important dates. The creation of the Dutch Republic, the Bank of England, 1694, the Bank of France, 1800, the Bank of Italy, 1893, the Bank of the USA, 1913, Bank of Soviet Union, 1917, Bank of Germany, 1918, the Bank of Spain, 1939.
I remember you talking about the Dutch being involved, during the first seasons of the banking industry. Um, I don't know if that's where you wanted to start, or if you had
Exactly.
another point.
That's exactly leading in to where I wanted to begin my presentation on the private central bankers. So if you don't mind, do you think you could play that short YouTube video now?
Yeah.
Back in 843, the three grandsons of Charlemagne signed a treaty that divided the empire between them. And the Treaty of Verdun gave one brother the West, which we now call France, and another the East, more or less Germany. But the older brother, who got the imperial crown, got a long strip of land running from the Low Countries to Italy, and because his name was Lothair, this land was named Lotharingia. Lotharingia looks terribly artificial for a state and impossible to defend. And in fact, it didn't last very long. But if you look again, you see that it reflects a geographical and economic reality. It runs from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, and it includes the major economic centers and the main lines of communication between them: the Rhine, the Alpine passes, and of course Italy. And in the 20th century, it becomes the spinal cord of the European economy, so keep your eyes on it. Now, when European trade revived in the Middle Ages, that revival was anchored at the two ends of what was once Lothar's realm, the Low Countries and Italy, especially Italy, where one great business and manufacturing center was Florence, here. Between the two ends, then as now, stretched the axis of European commerce. Around the Alpine passes and along the Rhine, trading towns grew up or were reborn, like Cologne. And the rest of trade revolved around that axis. In the north, a league of German cities called the Hansa, Riga, Danzig, and this one Lübeck, mostly along the Baltic and connecting with Scandinavia, Poland, and Russia. In the center were Champagne with its fairs, where merchants from north and south could meet about halfway, Lyon between the Rhone and the Alps, and Augsburg between the Danube and the Rhine, and also close to the Alps. But the real wealth of the Middle Ages was at the gateways. Venice, on which the Mediterranean trade was focused, and Bruges, on which the Baltic and North Sea trade was focused. In the 16th century, however, Venice began to decline. She was no longer mistress of the Mediterranean because of the Turks, and she was no longer mistress of the spice trade because of the Portuguese. With the age of discovery, the Atlantic had taken over from the Mediterranean. As for Bruges, its harbor was silted up, and the shipping that normally would have gone to her shifted next door to Antwerp. The Portuguese took their spices to Antwerp, and the heavy goods from the Baltic also went there: grain, lumber, and herring, a crucial fish when there were 2 fast days a week, plus Lent. But then Antwerp declined as well, ruined by the wars of religion, and the wealth and the power that went with the wealth shifted to another North Sea port a bit up the coast, Amsterdam. Of course, this is a very schematic and superficial account of developments that took 4 centuries, roughly from 1200 to 1600. But what it helps to make clear is that all this time, and increasingly so, production, exchange, capital, wealth, credit were not at the courts of princes, but in these trading cities. Without their loans, without their other financial services, the princes couldn't operate. They especially couldn't make war, which was their chief occupation. And so, while dynastic states made war, city-states made profits.
So,
Oh, right.
so there was in the 843, the kingdom of Charlemagne was divided, and there was an ancient kingdom known as Lotharingia, which went from Italy up to like Amsterdam and the Dutch. You know, that was the trade, the hub of Europe, right? In that video, he mentioned that around the 1600s was the decline of Venice and the rise of Amsterdam. Okay, because Venice, it was run by Christians. You know, it was a Christian city, but they had a lot of Jewish friends. You know, there was a Jewish quarter. Shakespeare wrote a play called The Merchants of Venice, right? But the Jews in Venice had to live in a certain place, and they had to wear a certain color hat because Venice was a Christian town. But over in Florence, Italy, with the Medici, this is when the Jewish people really took over, and especially Milan, and so coming back to what I was saying, this kingdom of Lotharingia was the trade hub of the entire Europe. You know, they went from the seaports of Italy, crossed the Alps, and went into Switzerland down to the Amsterdam, right? So this was the main trade hub of the entire Europe. And in one of the last interviews, I mentioned that the Knights Templars started building temples and castles in the same cities which already had Jewish synagogues. Okay, there was Jewish synagogues, and the same trade route, you know, the kingdom of Lotharingia, the same trade route was where the Jewish people had started building synagogues, and then later the Knights Templar started building big castles. Okay, so this was the trade hub, and it wasn't until really the year 1581 was when the Dutch declared their independence. Okay, in 1581 the Dutch declared themselves an independent state. Okay, so why did they do that? Because they didn't want to have to pay taxes to the king anymore. They didn't want to have to listen to any of the laws written by the king. They said, we are going to create our own state, and we are going to create our own laws. So this is when the bankers, what we call the private central bankers, created their own state, and that's where their home base began. Okay, they declared their independence in 1581. In the year 1602, they created the Dutch East India Company. Okay, and then finally in 1607, they created that first stock exchange, the first global stock exchange, where they were betting on the incomes of certain colonies and things like that. And then finally in 1609 was the Bank of Amsterdam, which was the world's first private central bank. And from that point, these Dutch wanted to take over the rest of the world. Let's put a private central bank in every country. Okay, so that's why the home of the private central bankers, it was the Netherlands, you know, and their first bank was the Bank of Amsterdam. Okay, so any questions from that so far?
No, I'm glad you touched on that because that's been something that's been bugging me for a while. Like, where do the damn Dutch fall into this mix? So you don't hear too much about it. And again, I've said it before. I think it's just because they've been great at covering their tracks. Um,
Yeah.
or
There is one I do want to mention one thing while we're on the subject of the Dutch. There's a whistleblower by the name of Ronald Bernard, who was an ex-Illuminati, and he's a Dutch man who used to work for the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements. That's the bank of all the private central banks is the BIS, right? And that's where the Illuminati has their headquarters. And there was one Dutch guy who got in with the Illuminati, and then they eventually invited him to one party, an orgy. He used to go to all their orgies, but one day they invited him to a special kind of orgy where they were doing some kind of a child sacrifice. And that's when he quit the Illuminati and he started whistleblowing. So I have a video on my YouTube channel. I have the Illuminati series, part 1, the Pyramid of Power. And this Ronald
what
Bernard,
channel would that be on? Because I have your Facebook group on the links. I have your moon landing hoax channel, and I have your
yeah,
0 Point Institute channel.
yeah, on the moon landing hoax video, I created one video series called the Illuminati series, where there's 10 videos, and the first one is an Illuminati whistleblower named Ronald Bernard, who's from the Dutch, and he joined the Illuminati. And then once they invited him to this child sex ritual, then he quit the Illuminati and started blowing the whistle. And it's quite a powerful story. And he was high up in the Dutch banking system. So he's explaining the pyramid of power and how the Illuminati is pulling all the strings through the Bank of International Settlements, because that's where he used to work. So just mentioning that, you should definitely check out the Ronald Bernard. Okay. So now I want to come to the second part is, okay, how did the Dutch take over England? Okay. As soon as the Dutch created their own state, they created their own bank. Their next step was to take over England. Okay, so how did the Dutch take over England? This process began in the year 1620. Okay, 1620 was the merger of the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. So once the bankers got together and said, "Hey, let's stop competing, let's work together," so that's the beginning of how the Dutch took over England. Okay, so in 1620 was the merger of the Dutch East India Company with the British East India Company. Then in 1642 was the English Civil War. Okay, and this was when they started creating a parliament. They started brainwashing the people that what we need is a parliament, not a king. And this was the same bankers who were creating this so-called parliament, and the Dutch were using their puppet by the name of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was just a puppet of these Dutch bankers. And so in 1648, Oliver Cromwell led a bunch of troops to the English Parliament and captured all those Parliament members who were opposed to him and killed them. So this was how Oliver Cromwell took control over the British Parliament. And finally in 1649 they cut off the head of the king, right? They beheaded the king in 1649, right? Oliver Cromwell. So after the Dutch had taken control over the parliament and killed the king, then they launched a series of controlled opposition wars. In the year 1652, 1665, and 1672, they were called the First, the Second and the Third Anglo-Dutch Wars. These were just controlled opposition wars because the Dutch already had control over England. So they were just creating this controlled opposition war way back in the 1600s, you know. And then finally, what happened was, after these wars, the people of England were like, oh, we've had it with this parliament. This parliament is nothing but a bunch of corrupt bankers. So the British people wanted to bring back the king. So they did finally. In 1685, they brought back King James II. Okay. And the British people, we don't want this parliament. We want a king again. But that king only lasted 3 years, because as soon as they tried to bring the king back, the bankers launched what's called the Glorious Revolution, right? And after 3 years, they said, okay, you guys want a king? We'll give you a king. So they just put a Dutch king on the throne of England, right? So that was the King William III, you know. So they just put a Dutch king on the throne of England, and you know, it was like from that point they created their private central bank, right? In 1694 was the creation of the first Bank of England. So that's how the Dutch gained control of England. It began in 1620 with the merger of the Dutch East India Company, and then finally in 1694 they got their first Bank of England. Okay, any questions about England?
No, I was trying to think of that quote. What was it? You know, provide them their hero. Right now that you mentioned that, that's the quote that came up.
Yeah.
You got to provide the people their manufactured hero. And
Right.
I would argue that's kind of what's still going on with all these heroes
Yeah.
coming out of the woodworks.
Right. All right, so let me jump to the next part. After the bankers had gained control of England, their next step was the takeover of France. Okay. So how did these same Dutch bankers take over France? That's actually a much longer story, because it took them quite a bit longer. The Dutch started invading France in the year 1695, and they didn't get their private central bank of France all the way until 1800. So they had to fight quite hard to get France. But let me tell you the story of how these bankers took over France. It began in 1695 at the Siege of Namur. And this was when the Dutch and the British basically invaded France. So if you look at the year 1695, that was 1 year after the creation of the Bank of England. Okay, they didn't waste any time, you know. They got their Bank of England in 1694. Next year, 1695, they invade France, okay, at the Siege of Namur. Now, what happened after that? During the Siege of Namur, it's important here to mention that the Spain decided to join forces with France. Okay, previously Spain had joined forces with England because they were afraid of France. But then Spain all of a sudden woke up and they said, "Wait a minute. Our enemies are not France. Our enemy is actually England, because England joined together with the Dutch, you know." So finally, after the Siege of Namur in 1695, Spain switched sides. They said, "No, France is our allies, not the British." Okay, and that launched a lot of wars after that. From 1701 to 1714, it was called the War of Spanish Succession. And here, you know, France and Spain were fighting against England and the Dutch. And then finally in 1740 to 1748 was called the War of Austrian Succession. Again, Spain and France were trying to defend their territories from the British and the Dutch. And all that led up to what was known as the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. Now, the 7 Years' War is actually known by many historians as the First World War, because when fighting broke out between Spain, France, England, and Dutch, it spread to all their colonies as well. Even in America, they were fighting um, in America and in the Asia, and all of these, the Spanish colonies, French colonies, and the English colonies were also fighting. So this was actually the world's first world war. So that was back in the 1756. It's called the 7 Years' War. But after that, what happened was, because they still didn't have control over France, so what happened was they started what is known as the coffee house culture in France. Okay, these Freemasons started meeting in French coffee houses, and they started discussing creation of a parliament. Okay, so the same thing they did in England. Let's create a parliament. We don't need a king anymore. So they started this. It was the same Freemasons who moved into France and started meeting in coffee houses and started what's known as the coffee house culture. And coming from that, of course, in 1776 was the creation of the Illuminati by Adam Weishaupt. In 1782 was the Congress of Wilhelmsbad, where the Jewish people and the Freemasons meet together, and they decided that we can create Illuminized Freemasonry. And that led up to the storming of the Bastille, the French Revolution. And the French people, they were just following the Freemasons. The Freemasons had basically brainwashed all of them. Let's go kill the king, like the British did, cut off his head, So in 1792, they cut off the head of the king of France. And finally, in the year 1800, they got their private central bank of France. Okay, so that's how these Dutch took over France. Okay, any questions about France?
No, I mean, this to me, you're giving the history of the beginning of the creation of the first central banks, but I would argue it's even the history of the New World Order. It all ties
Exactly.
back into all
Exactly.
this. So yeah, excellent stuff.
All right, so let's keep going now. After France, what was next? Next was Italy. Okay, the bankers had to take over Italy. So the takeover Italy began in the year 1802. Okay, just 2 years after the creation of the Bank of France. Okay, they didn't waste any time. Just 2 years later, they started taking over Italy. But here is a little bit complex, because in the year 1802, it was Napoleon who created the first Italian Republic. Okay, now at that time, Napoleon, as we all know, was a Freemason, right? So, but the story gets a little bit complex, because Napoleon did what he did a JFK on us. What I mean is that Napoleon started off as a very good puppet of the Freemasons. He was doing all their biddings. But then all of a sudden, Napoleon in 1805 declared himself emperor. And he wasn't supposed to do that. He was supposed to go along with this parliament thing. But instead, he turned against the parliament, and he says, now I'm emperor. So he did it's the same thing like a JFK tried to end the Fed. So Napoleon, when he declared himself emperor, he betrayed the Freemasons by doing that. Okay, so that's why the Freemasons sent him up to Russia, where he was defeated. At the and Napoleon, he was, all his troops were dying in the snow in the Russia. And Rothschild made a lot of money off the Battle of Waterloo. Probably you've heard that story. But anyway, so that's what happened to Napoleon. He started off a loyal puppet to the Freemasons because he was there with the creation of the Bank of France. and he helped create the first parliament, the first Italian republic. But then in 1805, he declared himself emperor, and he betrayed the Freemasons. So that's why the story gets a little complicated. But finally, it was in 1814, the Battle of Waterloo, where they, Napoleon lost, and he had to go into exile. So the story goes on. But what happened was, after Napoleon was defeated, this same Freemasons started moving into Italy. Okay, but in Italy, they were not called the Freemasons, they were called the Carbonari. Okay, that was the name of their secret organization, the Carbonari of Italy. Okay, so but they were just Freemasons, and they started talking about, we need to unify the entire Italy and create a parliament, right? Because at the time, Italy, there was many cities, many states already, and they needed to unify Italy into one giant state and create one parliament to control all of Italy. So these Freemasons started talking about that. And what happened was, in 1820, there was a riot against King Ferdinand there in Italy. This was where the Carbonari Freemasons rose up against an Italian king and tried to throw out the king, but it didn't work. In 1821, they rose up against King Charles Felix in another part of Italy, but again, they couldn't throw him out. And in 1831, the Carbonari Freemasons tried to rise up against Rome, and even tried to throw out the Pope, but of course that didn't work either. So after they failed after their first three attempts, they created a new organization known as the Young Italians. Okay, Giuseppe Mazzini was a Freemasonic organization called the Young Italians. Okay, in the year 1834, these Young Italians launched a revolt in the Italian city of Savary. And then later, but of course it didn't work. Then they tried some other revolts in 1841, 1843, 1845. They kept going to different cities, and they tried to launch these Freemasonic revolts, but they didn't work. In 1848, again, these Freemasons tried to drive out the Pope. They attacked Rome again, and they finally did. In 1848, they succeeded in throwing out the Pope. The Pope had to run away from Italy, and the Freemasons assassinated one of his key ministers, So the Pope went into hiding, But in 1850, the Pope was allowed back in, and they made some sort of an uneasy agreement between these Freemasons and the Vatican, right? So the Pope came back in 1850, but then finally, by the year 1870, so 20 years later, what was known as the Italian Unification Movement, which was just a Freemasonic movement, finally invaded Rome and took over Rome. And from that point, all of Italy was united. The Italian Unification Movement united all of Italy. They created one parliament, and the year 1893, they created the private central bank of Italy. Okay, so that's how these private central bankers took over Italy. All right, any questions on Italy?
No, sir.
All right, good. Well, what happened after Italy? Of course, the takeover of America, right? In 1913 was the private central bank of America, right? So how did the bankers do that? So they did that with the Panic of 1907, right? The Panic of 1907 was an economic depression which created such an economic problem that eventually the Americans were tricked into creating a private central bank again, right? America had gone for 77 years without a private central bank. As we all know, Andrew Jackson ended the private central bank in 1836. So from 1836, for 77 years, America was free with no private central bank. But in 1907, these bankers launched the Panic of 1907, economic depression, and they convinced the people, we need a private central bank again. And then in 1913, they got it. They got the Fed, right? So that was the next step, was the takeover of America.
When you were doing this research, did you come up across the Newburgh conspiracy at all?
No, please tell me about it.
So the Newburgh conspiracy, I would deem the first conspiracy in American for the American Empire, and it essentially occurred right after the Revolutionary War. The George Washington and the government didn't have enough money to pay out the soldiers, pay their pensions and whatnot. And a lot of them were about to revolt. And so legend has it. And so you have to wonder how much of this is actually true, how much of it is propaganda. But apparently George Washington came in the room with all these soldiers that were fed up with not being paid for their service. And he sought out the conspirators, because bankers were involved, and were like, you know what? If this guy's not paying you, George Washington, and we'll pay you guys. We'll help you guys out. And so George Washington, essentially, what it was the whole point of the Revolutionary War was to break off the British system, not to go back to it. And so with this Newburgh conspiracy, it was sussed out and they smashed it. People got their money and America lived and prospered happily ever after. I would argue, as I've dug into it, that that's kind of when the bankers slipped in, right after the Revolutionary War. So that'd be something, to definitely, I would suggest looking into, is the Newburgh conspiracy, NEWBURGH. Very fascinating, because there's not too much information on it, but the little that I've been able to dig up, at least for me, points to that's when bankers first started, putting their fingers all over the newly formed American empire.
Well, as I mentioned, okay, in 1782 was the creation of the first private central bank of America with Alexander Hamilton. And
Yep.
there's one piece of research which a lot of people don't know, and I think you'll find interesting, is that Alexander Hamilton married the daughter of a Dutch banker. Okay. So that's why he was so adamant on getting a private central bank into America, So anyway, but there was the Bank of America was the first private central bank, and then there was the first Bank of America, and then there was the second Bank of America. So there was already 3 private central banks before Andrew Jackson finally ended the private central banking period of America. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not familiar with the thing you're talking about, but yeah, ever since 1782, when they created the private central bank of America, that's why the British troops started withdrawing, because they already achieved their objective. They wanted America to have a private central bank, and they got it.
Yeah. So, and that's why I was wondering if that had ever come up during your research, because I wouldn't be surprised if there has to be some connection with, the 1782 and the Newburgh conspiracy deal. But that's definitely more homework, and this is the stuff that I love. Yeah, that was really the only comment and question that I had.
All right. Well, I made this video. It's called "The History of the Private Central Bankers" on my Moonhoax channel, And on that video, I go into a lot more detail about the history of America because, there was several presidents who were assassinated for trying to end the Fed, you know, not
Uh,
only Abraham
it's
Lincoln, but
not just Abraham
several
Lincoln.
others.
It's James Garfield is a very fascinating one because you read the Wikipedia, and I don't trust Wikipedia at all. So for Wikipedia to even saying it, it's pretty fascinating. But James Garfield, a few weeks after he made this glorious speech that we need to get the bankers out of our government, essentially, I can't remember word for word what his speech was, but an assassin tried to take him out, shot him. That didn't kill him. He was hospitalized for 2 months, and he died due to medical malpractice after 2 months after
Yeah.
getting shot. And it all just so happened to be right after his infamous speech against the bankers. So, and that's one that a lot of people never. I don't hear too many people talking about President James Garfield.
Right. So I mentioned that in my history of the private central bankers video. So let me jump back in here. What did the bankers do after they took over America? Okay. The next stop for the bankers was, of course, the creation of the Soviet Union, right? In 1917, the launching of the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, this is something, there's another fact which a lot of people don't know, is that the Bolshevik Revolution was launched 5 days after the signing of the Balfour Declaration. Okay. It's like, dear Lord Rothschild, we grant you the state of Israel. 5 days later, let's launch the Bolshevik Revolution. So it's just crazy, So that the bankers got there, as soon as the Bolshevik Revolution was launched, one of the first things the Bolsheviks did was they created the private central bank of the Soviet Union, right, which still exists today. Okay, nothing with the so-called collapse of the Soviet Union, nothing changed. Okay, many people think that somehow Russia is a different place from the Soviet Union. No, sorry. It's the same private central bank which was created in 1917, which still controls Putin today. So anyway, the bankers took over Russia in 1917 with the launching of the Bolshevik Revolution. All right, you got any comments there about Soviet Union or Russia?
No, I agree. Like I've said this before, but people want to go to sides. We talked about it earlier with, oh, I stand with Israel and this and that. It's the same thing with these regimes. At the end of the day, they they pretend they hate each other and let's duke it out in war. But at the very top are the puppet masters, and it all ties in to banking and control and
Yeah.
power of the money grid. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I completely agree with that.
One thing I should mention here, coming back to the current events, just recently, a few months ago, Israel started bombing Syria, and some people started asking questions like, "Wait a minute! I thought Putin was protecting Syria, so why is Putin allowing Israel to bomb in Syria?" And Putin is like, "Okay, I'll just look the other way while you guys do what you want there." So Putin's totally just a puppet of Israel. All right. So let's get back to our timeline here. What happened after the takeover of Russia? Of course, was the takeover of Germany, right? So in 1918 was the creation of the Weimar Republic. And the Weimar Republic, the first thing they did was they created the private central bank of Germany in 1918. Okay. And again, don't be fooled into thinking that Hitler was against these bankers. No, he was totally a puppet. So the same private central bankers who created the Central Bank of Germany in 1918, Hitler was just a puppet of them, okay? He had no intention of ever changing anything to the system, you know? Hitler's job was just simply to transfer Jewish people to Palestine. So, any questions about the takeover of Germany?
No, I think this is a key part though, because this is one where it's definitely a fascinating rabbit hole. But I think the thing that people need to understand is that there's a crap ton of bad press, I guess, on Hitler, but you can't lose sight of the fact that he was a puppet as well. You see Operation Paperclip, when you see Henry Ford as Hitler's go-to guy and hero, and him being a fan of the eugenicist movement, because you have these pro-Hitler people like, oh, he was doing nothing but great and goodness to the German people, and it's all fake news and blah blah. No, you got to look at everything. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I'm glad you touched on it, because that's how I view Hitler. I think he was just another puppet.
Yeah. We could probably do a whole nother show on Hitler, because, you know, I'm quite an expert in that subject. But one thing he did was, you know, he had to pretend like he was serious. So in order to pretend like he was serious, he had to go down and capture the Rothschild. There's this famous thing where Hitler captures Rothschild. He goes down to the Rothschild mansion and he breaks down the door and he captures Rothschild and all. So what happened to Rothschild after that? He was put into a hotel, right? Not a prison. He was actually put into a prison. He had to stay in a hotel for a few months, and then he was just sent to England. You know.
That
So,
sounds like Jeff Epstein. You remember when he got arrested in 2006, where for being a pedophile and raping kids, he was sent to a prison hotel where he was allowed to conduct business. His jail staff was allowed to wear suits and ties. That's what that sounds like. So history repeating itself, apparently.
yeah. All right. So let me jump back into my timeline here. So the last important piece of the puzzle is Spain. Okay. So Spain still didn't, after even after the bankers took over Germany in 1918, they still didn't have control over Spain. So the takeover of Spain, it took place between 1931 and 1939. Okay, there was the Spanish Revolution in 1931, and then in 1936 was the Spanish Civil War, and finally in 1939 they created the private central bank of Spain. So it's important, you know, that was the last country that they didn't have control of, really. So we mentioned 8 countries here, you know. It started, you know, it started in the Netherlands, then they took over England, then they took over France, then they took over Italy, then they took over America, then they took over the Soviet Union, then they took over Germany, and finally they took over Spain.